The talk is on custom dev tools to supercharge your team's productivity. It will be given by Brendan Morrell. He's a principal front-end engineer at Asprey Group. He's a creator of open source libraries, ESLint plugin style components A11Y, which has approximately around 50K downloads.
Great. Yeah. So as was mentioned, my talk is custom dev tools to supercharge your productivity. And I wanted to start out just by having everybody think a little bit about any kind of simple, non-creative mechanical tasks that they might spend time on regularly, or anything that maybe it's an error you make once in a while and you're constantly having to remind yourself not to do it, or any other piece of your daily routine that is unoptimized, that could save you time if there were some tweak added to it. Because I have noticed that, like as a developer, I run into these things all the time, and all of the teams I have ever worked on also have, these problems pop up day after day after day. And I think the most common thing that people do to solve these, which is very useful, is to look toward public tooling. So that could be anything. It could be, linters, VS Code extensions, or any libraries or frameworks. And those are going to increase, like help you do some of the tasks that you do day to day. But there is one big problem with them. I mean, the main problem is that they are lacking in specificity. So they're great. They do what they do very well, but they are built for the broader community. They're very general. So there are certain things that they will just never be able to address for you. So in order to address some of these like more granular, fine-grained things that you may encounter, well, what is the solution? I think based on the title of my talk, you know my answer, which is custom dev tools. So these, I think, are really underutilized in the community. It's pretty common to try to build stuff for other people or to download stuff that other people have done, but I don't think enough people are actually building tools that they use internally every day. So throughout this talk, I just want to basically go through and define exactly what I mean by this. What are custom dev tools? I'm going to go through some requirements that I have come up with for how to use them optimally, and how to avoid risks while creating these and using them. And then I want to give more of a broad overview of like a system you can put in place that's pretty simple, that allows you to put these in safely, and show just an example of how you could do this, and then a couple of just kind of random ones that I have used in the past that I think illustrate the different varying degrees of complexity and different use cases that will hopefully inspire people, give you a couple ideas about things you could do yourself. And then finally, I am going to go over my all-time favorite dev tool that I have put in at a number of different companies that I have worked at, which is super useful in fixing bugs. It helps in testing. It makes for a really robust development environment while you're just generally deving. And I call this user masquerading. And I'll go over exactly what that is when we get to that point. But diving right in, what are custom dev tools? I would define them as software utilities that are designed to help developers build, debug, and optimize applications. And as I said before, like the main differentiator between custom and non-custom would be that these are specific and that they are built for you and your application. You're not building them for anyone else. And really, they only work within the environment of your application and your team. Along with that, they generally, although not always, are actually built into the application. You can have some, and I'll actually show one of these that's part of your repo, but isn't really built into the front end or back end code of the app. But in general, they are mostly going to be actually something that you see within your web app. Unlike something like the browser console, they are tailored to the specific needs of the application in which they are housed and to the developers working on that application. with that in mind, like what are the goals that we have with these? Like what defines a custom dev tool that is successful? The first rule that I have is borrowed from our friends at Google here, and it's kind of, you could call it like the Hippocratic oath of custom dev tools, which is do no evil. And what I mean by that is that at the end of the day, your web application is designed to benefit your users. Okay. The dev tools do not do anything for your users. They are for you. So at the very least, a bare minimum that for a successful dev tool is you need to make sure that your dev tool is not hurting your end users and their experience of using your app. So that's rule number one. Rule number two is just be useful. They should be useful to you and your team. So I think that one is pretty self-explanatory, but the prevention of harm is a little bit harder. So I'm going to go into some conditions that I think set you up for success in that regard, and kind of guarantee that you don't do something that causes an issue down the line with your application. So I have 3 conditions for these, which I think define a successfully unharmful dev tool. And the first one is that it should be invisible. The end user should never see this. They should never have there should be no way that they know that this thing exists, since it is not for them. And in this sense, I mostly just mean like actually invisible. You shouldn't have any remnant of it that shows up in your code. But kind of tying this into the second one, which is basically that it should not have any effect on the way the application works in terms of performance. So like in the context of web apps, this is generally going to mean bundle size. But again, like moving one more level more abstract, it's basically just that it should have no effect on the production application. There should be no way that a detective going through would ever know that you had built this tool. And the non-visible portion of that is generally going to be performance. So those are 1 and 2. And then number 3 is that it should be secure. And that's, I think, kind of a two-way street, actually, between like the company and the users. So in terms of the company, what that means is the company secrets should be safe from the users. So you want to make sure that anything that is not public facing at your company, maybe something like new products you're working on, new feature sets, anything like that, you need to make sure that that is safe and not exposed to your users. And then the inverse of that is that your user info needs to be safe from your company. So you shouldn't have your dev tool exposing some sort of information to people at the company who are not authorized to see that. So how exactly do you do that? I have a couple of ways that I would say that they are both methods of doing this as well as triggers for how you can differentiate between where a dev tool can and cannot be placed. And I think the overarching one of these is going to be lazy loading and code splitting. So basically, if the code does not exist for your end user, it's lazy loaded, it's not showing up for them. Obviously, it meets all of those requirements because it is clearly invisible. It has no size because it doesn't exist. So that's not going to affect your performance. And then it's obviously secure in that it is non-existent. So that's, I think, the most frequently used tool I have to make this meet those conditions. Another thing that you can pay attention to is environment specificity. And by that, I mean it as a more general than it's frequently used in software. I'm not just meaning dev, staging, prod. It's really just any of the circumstances surrounding your code and how it is run. So this could be whether you are running in dev mode or whether you are built. Similarly, whether you are running locally, dev or built, doesn't matter, just running it locally versus whether the code is running deployed somewhere. And then the last one is the more common one that we talked about, which is just what are your APIs pointing to, basically? What environment are you in? Are you in dev, staging, prod, whatever? And those are different triggers you can use to determine which dev tools show up where and how people see them and what users will see them. Generally, it's going to be you. But yeah, so those are 1 and 2. The third thing that can be super useful in this is role-based permissioning. So you just basically, depending on the role of different users of your application, like you, maybe product managers, end users, anything like that, set up different permissioning and have that determine which dev tools are going to be shown at different times. My fourth one is certainly just like the catch-all, which is basically you can be creative. You can do whatever you want with these. Figure out what the needs are of your application and your team, and depending on that, you can do whatever you want to make these meet those criteria and be useful for your team. Like as an example, I had one situation where I needed to build some tools that were going to be available to non-technical employees who were not on our local network and were on prod off of our local network and not logged in. So like a lot of conditions for this, and hard to make it such that they would see this and other users wouldn't. So what we ended up doing was like when you came on, when you were at our office on the dev portal, it was on the same domain as our production application. So since it was a subdomain of the prod app, we were able to set a cookie when people would come on and log into that, and then that cookie would actually carry over to the main domain of our production application, and then we would key off of that to show dev tools to these non-technical, non-logged in employees off network. But the point is, you can just do a lot of things with these. So, you whatever you need, you should be able to figure it out. Just be careful. So let's kind of move on from there, and I'll just show you an example of this. I'm going to ask you to bear with me a bit because I'm about to commit the cardinal sin of presenting, and I'm going to attempt to show you a live demo of some kind of hodgepodge code that I put together for this presentation. But it should work out, and if it doesn't, just bear with me, and I'll explain it even if something goes wrong. But in order to do that, I'm going to stop sharing for a second and share my entire screen as opposed to just this window. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to show is like super simple, and it's I think probably a lot of people have this in place, but I've definitely been at some companies that don't, and it causes a lot of bugs. So just like a very baseline, simple tool that I use on the command line is just something that basically grabs all of your environment variables and syncs them down to your local, so that you don't have to do something where you're copying and pasting different files and things get out of sync, and maybe someone adds a variable and you don't have it, or you mix things up and it causes you like an hour of debugging issues while you're trying to figure something out, and it turns out you just flipped something. So I always recommend people have something like this. Ours live in AWS parameter store. So I just have, my AWS creds here, and I've got a little node script that runs up, grabs all of those and saves them into all of these files, which you'll see show up down here right below this here. So now I've got all of those. And I am currently running actually this application pointing to like prod of this. And that's going to illustrate this second tool, which again is super simple, but has saved me a lot of time, which is that when I am pointing to prod, I want this to happen. Basically, I want to have like a little indicator that pops up and tells me that I'm pointing to prod. On this one, if I get rid of it, that sets a cookie and it just like doesn't show up for another day. But it keeps this banner right here forever that will just remind me that I'm pointing to prod, because I've had a lot of like times, as stupid as it sounds and as simple as this sounds, but you point to prod, I like go fix a bug or something, and then maybe I'm done for the day. I close my computer and I hop back on the next day, and I completely forget that I am in a place where I need to be a little bit careful and don't want to be modifying any data. And it looks like I am logged out. And again, I'm going to pause for 1 second to make sure that something sensitive doesn't show here, but I will hop back on a second after I log in. Okay, there we go. I'm logged in, sharing again. Okay, so now that I'm logged in, here we are. This is my little demo application. So generally how I have this set up is either I've moved this to like a widget that shows up for employees, and then it just so that I can access it on every page. But in this talk, essentially I've got like an admin panel right in here that for an employee is going to show up. And then you've just got your separate dev tools page. And again, this just guarantees that nobody sees it. It's, it doesn't affect the bundle. You just load everything in afterward, and then you can kind of do whatever you want in here very safely. So here's like a simple example of some stuff you can do. I like throwing a couple of Git pieces of information in there. Again, this is part of the deployment process that puts the SHA and the tag in there, so it's not going to show anything here. But I like including those in there so that you can cut down on wasted time when like you do an deployment and someone doesn't see a feature working the way that it should. And like maybe the reason for that is that the deployment failed and nobody noticed it, or maybe, like somebody has some caching issues. So they are actually running the old code that isn't deployed, and that's not why they aren't seeing it. So you can just very quickly do a sanity check with this stuff and be like, okay, are we actually looking at what we think? I also like putting stuff in there about like the environment and allowing you to switch the environment. So like something where when you click any of these, it's just going to kill your server, grab the correct variables, and then reboot it up in that environment. I find it super useful, a lot of a big time saver. And then kind of similar to that, things to restart the server or clear like your dev server cache. And so those are like really simple ones that you can use. I guess on the more, and you can also ignore this stuff down at the bottom. That's for the user masquerading. But for the moment, on the more complex end of some of the things that you could do is like if you look at this airplane mode indicator here, this is a dev tool that I made because I found that a lot of times I'm traveling and I don't have access to Wi-Fi, but I don't want that to stop my ability to work. So this is something that allows me to continue developing even while I am not online. So the way this works is basically, if you look at the network tab here, we use Apollo client, so you'll see these. But basically, yeah, let me actually put on my network tab for that. But what this does is every time a request is made through, as I said, for us, GraphQL and Apollo, the request itself and the result of that are saved to a file locally. And then as soon as the Wi-Fi kicks out, this will automatically pull from that local file and serve it back instead of, actually making the request. So if I start that process right now, you can see I've got this little record icon. It's starting to write all of those the queries that are in the cache. It's writing those to disk. And yeah, so if I go here, you see here's my React India data query. And I'm going to head back to DevTools. This just loads those into the cache. But if I go to, my actual file service here, you can see I've got this hashed, file with my React India data mock set up in here. And so as soon as I lose Wi-Fi, that's actually going to be what ends up showing up on the screen. So I can go back here and you can see that since we're in airplane mode, that pulled that from disk and into the cache. And so that still works. And you could see that query didn't run here. But if I clear this and I turn airplane mode off, that query is going to rerun. And that's where I would get this error. So that's, as I said, a more complex one that I think is kind of cool. And I recommend you be creative and put something in, whatever suits your needs. Just try to make something fun. So that's broad overview of some of the things that you can do. I'm going to go back to just sharing a single tab here, which will be, okay. So at this point, as I mentioned, I'm going to go and show you user masquerading, which is my favorite dev tool. And basically what this is in principle, what it's allowing you to do is run your application as though you were any of your users. So I think that the best way to think about this would be like it's if you've ever heard of LogRocket or Sentry Session Replay, there are services that allow you, like while a user is using your application, it's recording that session and saving that session data, some of the network requests and things like that, so that if you get an error, a bug report or something like that, you can go back to the session and just at least see the user journey and see what led to that, and then hopefully reproduce it and be able to fix it. So I consider this user masquerading kind of like those things on steroids, because you're not just able to see what happened. If somebody tells you a bug, you can essentially just become them, and then you can go through and do it yourself on your local and actually be stepping through the code and everything and debugging that issue as though you were they. It's super useful for, as I said, for bug fixing, but it's also great for like testing and while you're deving for your diversity of information, because you can test out different features or develop against different features using a ton of different like user data, different users and things like that, and make sure that everything works well for everybody there without having to do a bunch of artificial seeding of data and things like that. And it's really easy to put this in, and you can do it securely and with a very small footprint. The way that I have it set up, I'm going to go through a couple of requirements. You probably could even omit some of these, but at least it's what I have found to be the easiest way to do it. But the requirements are things I think everyone should have. Basically, you're going to need a server or some sort of backend like API endpoint for these requests to be made securely. You want to have as close to a single point of data transfer as possible, just because there's logic that is a branch from a normal request to one of these masquerading requests, and you do not want to have to duplicate that all over your app. As I said, you might have to do it in certain cases with separate services that just don't jive together. But in general, you want to, wherever your requests are being made from, you want to encapsulate it into a single point so that you can branch these once and just deal with it with a single gatekeeper. Then the third thing is you need different levels of permissions. So, obviously you want these branches to work with people who have permission to do this, like developers. No longer take their normal trajectory, and you pass this user ID override onto some sort of, internal backend gateway, where on that gateway, the request is verified to have been something that is originating from your actual user. You verify that that user has the ability and the permissions to make this request, and then you send the request. You essentially just proxy it as is to your database, or in our case we use Hasura, but whatever it is that you use, you proxy it through to that, with the modification that you essentially just tell your service, like, instead of giving me the data for my user, I want you to give me the data for user X based on this ID. And then it will check whether, you have permission to do that. And if you do, it will send back that data instead of your user's data. And before I continue, I am sure that as I bring this up, people are probably thinking that sounds cool, but it also seems incredibly dangerous, because although it's hidden, it seems like someone can just, mock this up somehow and hit your service, and then they can look at somebody else's data, which would be a massive security concern, which I understand the concern. But and this slide's just saying that's exactly what it is. You don't want to expose sensitive information. You don't want to have unauthorized access. But as maybe was clear in the original explanation, there's really nothing unique going on about this. It feels a little bit weird because you're not used to seeing this other users' data being visible on the client in this way, but it really is no different from just standard database access. So if you have that set up and you have your authorization set up correctly, this is really the same thing as that, even though it is in an unfamiliar format where it's displayed on the client, it really should follow the same rules as any of those. So if you're using if you're verifying their jot on the back end, you know that it is that user because you're the only one who can unencrypt that jot and see, the user data in there. So you can verify that this is the actual user they claim to be. And then similarly, if your database is set up correctly, this is kind of the same thing as the fact that when I go into a database as a developer, like in my user, I am able to query certain things, and some things it's not going to allow me to query, and some things it will. But if you have those permissions set up correctly, this is just doing the exact same thing and just carrying that data out of the database and then back into your client-side application when you're running it, locally or whatever. So if you do not if you're not allowed to do something in the database, you're also not allowed to do it as a masquerader. And this goes even beyond this. Like if there's some stuff that nobody should be able to look at, it's the same rules that apply for that with the database. If you have data masking or anything, that will happen in the same way here as it does at the database level. So if you set it up correctly, you should run into no security concerns that are any different from those that you would have just with your existing database. So moving beyond that, I guess, let me show you. This is going to be really brief because there's not too much to show since this is all stubbed data anyway, but I will go back to go back here. Let's get rid of this stuff, and I will show you and go back online, and I'll show you exactly how this works. So here I am. You can see I'm Brendan Morrell. I'm going to pop over into our dev tools, and then down below, since I based on my permissions, I'm able to query other users and get their user IDs and stuff. And I have not started masquerading yet, but that's just built into our system. So I'm now able to see this demo at Realize Me. So I'm going to click into that, and I have this pop open into a new tab. And that the reason for that is I like being able to keep this tab kind of uncluttered as my normal user in case I need to do other things. And then it also allows me to open up multiple tabs, and they can all have independent users, and I can just do multiple things at once. But basically, this gets passed over with a query param having that user ID, and then my state management pulls it in, says from now on, any of the outgoing requests, send it to this, as I said, the gateway that verifies it and then asks for this user's data and sends that back instead. So when we go over here, in fact, you can see it already just worked because I am in Denver. The demo user is in LA. So it's already operating as that demo user. And that's why it's asking me, I'm in a new time zone or whatever. So there we are. These requests are now going through. It's getting verified as the request being made by Brendan, but it is requesting data for demo at Realize Me that gets proxied through in its entirety, other than that minor modification I just mentioned. And then whatever comes back from that is now what's getting fed into the application. And you can see right here that if I go here, no longer am I Brendan Morrell, and I am now the demo user. So yeah, that's basically it. That's masquerading. Those are dev tools that I think you can put in place, and as well as just a quick overview of how you should be doing them. And I hope you found it useful. I appreciate you taking the time to listen, and yeah, thank you, and go out and be great.